The stranger next door wasn't supposed to be this irresistible. Part 2. "Hey buddy, you moving?" A voice broke through my haze, and I blinked up to find a woman staring me down with her cart full of groceries. Behind her, a line had formed, all equally irritated and waiting for me to get out of the way. "Oh, sorry." I stepped aside, feeling the heat rise to my face as people filed past, giving me a few chosen looks. I downed it again, completely zoned out. Right in the middle of the grocery store entrance. I was briefly lost in my head because I thought I'd spotted him in the crowd. Leo. Figures that he now haunted me the way Mark did. I should have known that moving away wouldn't erase him, but I'd been desperate. I need a clean break, a fresh start from him. I even switched apartments without telling him where I was going. Blocked his number, erased his text, the whole works. I grabbed my grocery bags and made my way to the quiet of my new place. It wasn't much: a bed, a stack of cardboard boxes, some half-assembled furniture, a blank slate. Later that evening. None of it made sense. Leo was a cop. Mark, my Mark, had been some sort of notorious drug dealer. How had I missed all of it? All those little details I'd brushed off, the strange late-night calls, the vague excuses, they all started creeping back, taunting me as I sat there in my empty, barely furnished kitchen, half-heartedly stirring spaghetti. And to think it all had seemed so normal. A good meal, a little laugh over a glass of wine. It felt like the beginning of something simple and real back then. But now, the memory was layered with betrayal. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts, and I glanced down to see another unknown number. Persistent, I thought. The number had been feverishly calling me every few minutes that evening, and I didn't need to be a detective to figure out who was behind it. I let it go to voicemail, again. Every ring, every missed call chipped away at my resolve, though. Part of me wondered what he'd say if I did answer. If he'd try to weave me some story, some grand apology. But what was the point? I wasn't sure I'd believe anything that came out of his mouth. The connection we'd built, the trust I'd finally begun to feel, I wasn't sure any of it had been real. Thinking about it all, a sharp wave of utter disgust blew up in my chest, and I pushed the plate of spaghetti away. It was the first meal I'd ever cooked for Leo. That dinner, I remembered feeling nervous, hoping he'd like it. Now, all it reminded me of was the heartbreak he'd inflicted on me, the lies he'd spun as casually as he'd laugh at my jokes. With a sigh, I shut off my phone, silencing it completely. I didn't need to hear whatever excuses Leo had lined up, nor did I want to. I had been fooled by Mark, hurt by Leo, and now, as I sat broken in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had become one long betrayal after another. Trust? It seemed like the cruelest joke of all. 2 weeks later. Mark used to say that time, like alcohol, dulls all pain, but I wasn't so sure. Each heartbeat still ached, but at least it wasn't the razor-sharp sting it had been for those first few weeks. I'd even healed up enough to pick up a hobby, bird-watching of all things. I'd taken to the park with a set of binoculars most mornings, focusing on the sparrows and starlings instead of the mess that my life had somehow become. It was a chilly morning, and I just settled into my usual park bench, scanning the branches overhead, when someone sat down beside me. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I could smell him, that blend of lilies and ground coffee, a scent as unmistakable as it was now irritating. "Leo," I said flatly, keeping the binoculars trained on a distant pine tree. "Just leave, I don't want to hear it." "Jamie," he started, voice calm but urgent. "Just hear me out, all right?" I lowered the binoculars just enough to glare in his direction before setting them down. "No, I don't have to hear anything. You lied, you used me, and now I'd like you to leave before I make a scene." Leo sighed, reaching out to touch my arm. Reflexively, I yanked it away, scowling. "Don't," I warned, my voice ice cold. "You think I can just forgive this because you feel like explaining it to me?" His shoulders sagged, but his gaze stayed steady. "You deserve the truth, Jamie, the full story." I shook my head, anger flaring. "Truth? Really? I thought I already had the truth, Leo. But you kept this whole life from me, this whole act." "Listen, Jamie," he said quietly, almost pleading. "This wasn't how I planned for things to go. Not with you. When we met, when things started, it became something I didn't expect. I didn't want to hurt you." I held his gaze for a second, searching his face for any trace of the man I thought I'd known. "But you did hurt me. You hid everything from me. You let me think this was real, and now what? I'm just supposed to, what, understand?" "Jamie, please," he murmured, voice rough. "It wasn't just an assignment to me. You were never just some part of my work. I meant every moment. I exhaled, the hurt rising back to the surface as raw as ever. It doesn't matter anymore, Leo. What's real, what's a lie? I don't even know anymore. With that said, I took my leave, not bothering to spare him any more parting words. 3 days later. After that encounter with Leo in the park, the silence that followed felt both a relief and a weight on my chest. No more cryptic calls or random messages from strange numbers, no surprised run-ins. He'd actually stopped, it seemed. I was starting to think I could breathe again. Maybe I could really get back to normal. But of course, that was too much to hope for. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I just stepped out of a job interview that had gone so badly, I was still replaying the rejection in my head as I walked down the steps. The sting of being turned down again was still fresh when I noticed them. A squad of officers standing near the building entrance, fully armed and scanning the area. I froze. They looked like they meant business, and sure enough, when one of them spotted me, his expression sharpened and he started to approach. Instinct kicked in, and I raised my hands bewildered. "Is there a problem, officer?" I managed, my voice shaking slightly. For a ridiculous second, I wondered if I'd somehow bombed the interview badly enough for them to call the police on me. My heart pounded as I tried to piece it together. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned to his partner, who produced a set of cuffs. "James Davison," he said, his tone heavy and no nonsense. "You're under arrest for suspected association with a known drug dealer, Mark Wishmer." I blinked, my mouth opening and closing as I struggled to process the words. "What? No, there has to be some mistake. I could barely get the words out as he stepped closer, his expression as hard as the handcuffs in his grip. Later that evening, when I arrived at the station, reality slammed into me, hard. Mark wasn't just some guy with a few shady connections. He was a major player, wanted in 6 states, and Leo? He wasn't just a neighborhood cop with a casual smile and coffee habits. Leo was FBI, and there he was across from me in the interrogation room, sharp and polished in a suit and tie, a professional mask where his familiar, easygoing demeanor used to be. There was no trace of the man I'd shared laughs and late-night talks with. In his place was Agent Brothwick, who looked at me with a cold, unreadable expression like I was just another case file. As he spoke, there was nothing personal in his tone. No warmth, no understanding, just clipped questions delivered with precision. I'd lost my friend, my whatever he had been, and all I had now was the FBI agent sitting across from me. Leo cleared his throat, flipping open a manila folder in front of him, his eyes scanning through the pages. "Let's get right to it, Jamie," he began, his voice low and controlled, as if we'd never had anything more than this formal relationship. "When was the last time you were in contact with Mark Wishmer?" I took a shaky breath, clutching the sides of my chair. "It was over a year ago, Leo. Agent Brothwick," I corrected, biting back the word that suddenly felt so foreign and distant. "He ghosted me out of nowhere. I haven't heard from him since then, I swear." He didn't acknowledge my nervous rambling. His eyes stayed glued to the file in front of him. "When you last spoke with him, what was the nature of your relationship?" I shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of every word and the cold silence of the room pressing in on me. "We were dating, and I had no idea about any of this, about him being this kind of person. He just left, and I was heartbroken." "Stick to the question," Leo interrupted, his voice like a blade. He didn't look up, didn't give any reaction to my words. "The nature of your relationship, Jamie." "He was my boyfriend," I muttered, feeling a flush creep over my cheeks. We were close, but I had no clue about any of this, Leo. Agent Brothwick." He glanced up just briefly, a flicker of something in his eyes before he set them back on the file. "Did he ever mention anyone to you? People he worked with or places he frequented?" I felt a pang in my chest, the intimacy of that memory now weaponized and turned against me. No, nothing like that. I thought he had a boring office job. He told me he was working long hours sometimes, traveling for conferences. I didn't know it was anything criminal. It was just normal. The sharp clack of his pen tapping against the desk cut through the silence. "Jamie, this is bigger than you might realize. Mark's list of known associates is long, and anyone who had prolonged contact with him falls under suspicion. So, I need you to be thorough with your answers. Are you telling me you never once suspected he was involved in something illegal?" "No," I said, feeling my voice shake. "Never. I would have left him if I'd known." Leo's gaze finally lifted from the file, but his expression was just as impassive. "That remains to be seen." He leaned back, assessing me with an intensity that felt foreign and detached. We need a full account of every major interaction, every place he took you, any names or faces that stand out." "But I don't remember anything like that," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "Leo, please, you have to believe me." "You're going to have to try." His words cut through my plea with an ice-cold finality. It was going to be a long night tonight. Somehow I just knew it. The next morning. The night had been endless. I'd pulled an all-nighter with Leo and his team, sifting through every piece of intel they had on Mark, cross-referencing it with the fragments of information I could remember from our time together. They had 2 massive binders full of surveillance, reports, and God knows what else. Mark's life in ink and paper. By dawn, I was sitting on a bench just outside the station, practically running on fumes. My eyes stung from the lack of sleep, and my mind was a jumbled mess of half-processed memories and fresh shocks. Eventually, Leo joined me, looking just as ragged. He handed me a coffee, his own eyes heavy with dark circles. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, his tie hung loose, and he looked exhausted. I could tell this whole thing was taking a toll on him, maybe more than he'd ever admit. For a while, we just sat there, both of us quietly staring off into the early morning haze. The silence was thick, almost comforting, as we nursed our coffees and tried to find some semblance of normalcy after a night like that. After what felt like ages, Leo broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted things to get this far," he said, not looking at me. His gaze locked somewhere on the pavement. I stayed silent, staring into my coffee. What could I say? There was too much to unpack, too many layers to the betrayal I felt. He cleared his throat, drawing my attention as he finally met my gaze. "My partner, she died on a job with me, an operation involving Mark Wishmer and his crew. We tracked him to a ferry port and things went south fast. He and his people were armed to the teeth and we weren't ready for that level of resistance." I could see something raw flicker across his face again. Grief? Guilt? Anger? Something I couldn't quite pin down. "Her name was Eleanor. She was 26, new to the force, still fresh, still hopeful. She was good, Jamie. A damn good cop, and Mark took everything from her." I swallowed, my throat tight, and managed a quiet, "I'm sorry, Leo." But he shook his head slightly. "It's okay, this isn't about revenge. That's not what drives me. This is about doing what I swore to do, about keeping people safe." He looked down, taking a deep breath. "But I'm sorry too. Sorry for how this played out, for everything. I didn't tell you." The weight of it all sat between us, too heavy for words, too complex for any neat resolution. Just as he was about to continue, his phone buzzed and he glanced down at the screen, his face tightening as he answered with a hurried, "Yeah, I'm on my way." He looked back at me. "I have to go. I'll try to check in on you as soon as I can, but until then, you're free to go." I slowly nodded as he turned around and headed back into the station. 1 week later. In the days that followed, I was practically a regular at the police station, like I'd signed up for some unpaid, unwanted gig in crime fighting. Every time I walked through those heavy doors, I was reminded of the sharp line I'd unknowingly crossed. It was surreal. One moment, I was a regular guy with a regular job, trying to move on from heartbreak, and the next, I was this piece in a puzzle I didn't even know I'd been a part of. But I went. Over and over, each visit felt heavier than the last as the agent shifted through Mark's history and questioned me endlessly, trying to string together some cohesive plan. Then, during one session, we hit something big. It was just another cross-referencing run, going over every last shred of detail I'd shared. Leo and his team were running names, places, and addresses when something new popped up. Details of Mark's past that no one had known about. His parents and their old family farm in Nebraska. A farm. Nebraska. Something clicked and the memory hit me so hard I could practically smell the whiskey he used to drink as he rambled about it. On those rare nights when he'd let his guard down, really let it down, Mark would go on about his childhood. He'd mention the farm he was raised on, talking about how one day he'd retire there, find peace in that quiet corner of nowhere. I never thought of much of it then, chalked it up to nostalgia or maybe a drunk man's daydream, but now it felt like a missing link. I turned to Leo, barely able to contain the revelation. "He talked about a farm, Leo," I said, my voice urgent. "He said he wanted to retire there. That was his place, his escape." Leo's eyes lit up like I'd handed him the final piece of the puzzle. "Jamie, this is huge. If he's hiding anywhere, it could be there." Before I could even reply to him, he was up on his feet and out the door, barking orders as he hurried out. 3 days later. By the time Leo and I arrived in Nebraska, tension was at an all-time high. The quiet, open fields, The small town charm, the rolling expanse of farmland, everything seemed to clash with the gravity of why we were there. Somewhere tucked away in this idyllic countryside was Mark's childhood farm, and maybe even Mark himself. Leo and his team coordinated with the local authorities as soon as we arrived. Leo briefed the officers, walking them through every angle of the plan, every bit of information they gathered. Meanwhile, my job was simple but critical. I was there to confirm Mark's voice in the surveillance, should we pick anything up. Once we got set up, a small team and I positioned ourselves at the mobile command post nearby, well out of sight. They tapped into the local grids, and I watched as the tech team adjusted the audio equipment, each dial and meter sharpening my focus. Finally, a soft crackle came through, and I tensed listening. Leo and the team had zeroed in on an old barn on the property's outskirts, which appeared active on and off over the last few days. They had positioned a few hidden mics around the barn's main doors, and as the first round of static gave way, voices broke through. There was a deep, gruff tone mixed with laughter, a voice I didn't recognize. Then a second one joined in, faint and almost drowned out by the distance of the mic, but it was unmistakable. Mark. My stomach twisted as I confirmed it, giving the team the go-ahead over the radio. "That's him. That's definitely Mark." Leo responded with quiet acknowledgement, his usual calm and focus solidifying over the comms. As the team continued gathering evidence, I remained back with the command post, each second filled with tense silence as Leo and the team crept closer to the barn. This time it was controlled, precise, nothing left to chance. My role was limited, but I was close enough to feel the adrenaline of the operation, far enough to know I was safe. After what felt like hours, a final confirmation came through, and the signal was given to move in. Leo's voice came over the radio with a sense of resolve I'd weirdly come to trust. "Let's bring him in." 1 day later. The raid was over quickly. The police encountered some resistance from Mark's crew, but nothing they couldn't handle. They moved in fast, precise, and with complete control. When the dust settled, Mark was in cuffs, his associates subdued, and the operation had gone off without a single casualty on the police's side. It was exactly the outcome Leo and his team had been hoping for. Later that evening, I was back in my apartment, trying to unwind, when my phone buzzed with an alert. I clicked on it, and there it was, the news headline I'd been anticipating, but wasn't fully prepared for. Notorious drug trafficker Mark Wishmer arrested in Nebraska sting operation. I watched as the screen cut to live footage of Mark being led out by officers. His hair was longer, grown past his shoulders, and a rough beard had added years to his face. He looked gaunt and worn, his eyes sunken, but they hadn't changed. Those eyes, the same ones I used to know so well. A sharp pain tugged at my chest. Watching him, I felt a mess of emotions, relief, sadness, even anger. The person I'd once loved was gone, replaced by this stranger on my screen. And yet those eyes, they held memories I couldn't quite let go of. After a long pause, I reached over and switched off the TV. It was over now. Mark was in custody. I took a deep breath, letting the silence settle over me. It was over, truly over, and maybe now I could finally move forward. I went to bed that night wishing that sleep would bring some peace or clarity. I really hoped this chapter had finally come to a close. 2 weeks later. The FBI set me up with a job as a customer care rep at a telecom company, partly as a thank you and partly to help me get back on my feet after everything. The work was straightforward, and I was grateful for the distraction. I kept my head down, gave myself some space to breathe, and let the dust settle. I hadn't seen Leo since he'd gone off for the raid, which made sense. After an operation like that, I figured he'd be buried in a mountain of paperwork and follow-ups. On Thursday, as I clocked out of work, I was locked into my usual routine. Catch the bus, head home, maybe have a quiet dinner. But when I reached the bus stop, I noticed a sleek, dark sports car parked right in my spot, blocking where I'd normally wait. Annoyed, I was about to go over and give the driver a piece of my mind when the window rolled down, and I came face to face with a woman that immediately caught my eye. A tall woman, sharp, dressed in a tailored suit. The type of person you knew wasn't here by accident. I ignored her, turning on my heel and brushing past as I quickened my pace. "Jamie Foster," she called, her voice flat and precise. "I'd like to speak with you." I kept walking. "Whatever you need, I don't have it. My part in all of this is done." "Actually, it's about Leo," she said, unfazed by my blatant snub. "He's been hospitalized, and he asked to see you." I stopped in my tracks, my heart slamming into my chest. "What?" My voice came out barely above a whisper. Her expression softened just slightly as she took a step closer. "I'll explain everything on the way," she said, gesturing towards the passenger seat. 30 minutes later. I rode in the blacked-out government car next to Amanda, a name I could tell was just a cover. She stared straight ahead, barely a word spoken, and I'd given up trying to get more details on Leo's condition after the third attempt. Finally, just before we reached the hospital, she broke the half-hour silence. After the raid, Leo was attacked by Mark's associates. He managed to outsmart them, and they're in custody, but he crashed his car in the process. Fortunately, the injuries aren't life-threatening. I exhaled shakily. That's lucky? Amanda stayed silent, her face unreadable as we arrived. She led me through the hallways, each step feeling like a countdown. Finally, we reached Leo's room. "I'll be out here," she said, crossing her arms as I stepped inside. There was Leo lying in bed, bruised, arm in a sling, and hooked up to endless monitors. My chest tightened, vision blurred for a moment. "Hey," I heard a weak voice say. "You just gonna stand there?" I blinked as Leo's eyes slowly opened, managing a faint, painful smile. "Leo," I said, swallowing hard. "What happened?" He grimaced, trying to sit up. "Long story. Let's just say I made some people mad." "You don't need to explain now," I said, stepping closer. "Just rest, okay?" But he tried to keep talking. "Jamie, listen. I'm sorry. I know I don't deserve you being here." "Don't do this now," I interrupted. "Apologies can wait. Just focus on getting better." He chuckled, wincing. "Bossy as ever, huh?" "Yeah, well, you're the one who never listens." We spent the next couple of hours catching up, me filling him in on life since the raid. As he nodded, I felt the irony, how I'd avoided him for weeks, yet here I was sharing everything, feeling guilty for all he'd gone through because of Mark and me. 2 weeks later. The next 2 weeks blitzed by with a new routine of hospital visits, odd bouquets of flowers, and even a few fruit baskets. Like clockwork, I'd swing by after work, checking in on Leo, making sure he was alright. I didn't want to think too deeply about why I kept coming back. It was easier to just focus on the task of playing nurse and friend, but admittedly, the forced proximity was doing a number on the feelings I'd thought I'd successfully buried. No one should be subjected to Leo's charm for extended periods. The guy could make watching paint dry seem fascinating, and every time I walked into his hospital room, there he was with that same half smile, practically daring me to keep up my cold front. And it wasn't even the usual harsh, sterile scent of the hospital that greeted me in his room. No, his familiar scent, lilies and coffee, lingered in the air, practically clinging to everything. It was a small thing, but somehow it felt like a window back into a time when things were simpler. At first, the atmosphere was awkward, like, I'm not sure if I should sit or stand kind of awkward. We both had our guards up, our words limited to polite exchanges, afraid of setting off any minds from the past. Most days I'd bring a magazine or a book and just sit with him, saying very little but present enough to make sure he knew he wasn't alone. And then somehow things shifted. By his 104th apology, or maybe it was the 105th, I realized I was tired of icing him out. I'd gone from silently glaring at him to, well, being something close to cordial. He'd joke about something meaningless and I'd let out a grudging laugh, and then we'd move on without bringing up the painful parts of our history. It wasn't perfect, but the walls began to lower bit by bit. 3 days later. 3 days later, the day of Leo's discharge finally came. It was a lot more somber than I'd imagined it would be. He was getting out, sure, but the weight of reality hung over both of us like a thick fog. I was helping him with his buttons, something he couldn't do himself, but that I insisted on doing to keep my hands busy as he packed up his things. He'd cracked a few weak jokes, but even he seemed to feel the strain. "What's with the long face?" he asked finally, his usual teasing tone softened. "You look like you're heading to a funeral." I tried to play it off, shoving his remaining things into a bag with more force than necessary. "It's nothing, just your Berlin assignment, you know, I'm happy for you, it's a good step professionally." "Mostly cushy paperwork, really," he said, smiling as he tried to downplay it. "Nothing dangerous, just lots of pin pushing and staring out of office windows. And it'll only be for about a month." I knew what he was trying to do, and I appreciated it, but the thought of him moving away, even if just for paperwork, stung more than I cared to admit. "Well, paperwork or not, if I hear so much as a paper cut happened to you over there, I'll come find you and give you hell," I said, hoping it came off as a joke rather than the thinly veiled warning it was. As we reached the hospital entrance, a sleek government car idled at the curb, waiting to whisk him away. We stood there for a second longer than we probably should have, the bustle of the hospital entrance a strange contrast to the quiet between us. Before I could pull back, He pulled me into a hug, his warmth and his scent, that same lilies and coffee mix enveloping me. And then just as quickly he stepped back. "I'll be in touch," he said with a soft smile as he climbed into the car, and with one last glance, he was gone, leaving me with an emptiness that felt larger than I wanted to admit. 1 month later. It was strange how naturally we'd slip back into each other's lives despite his absence. When Leo left for Berlin, I half expected it to be the end, or at least a long, slow fizzle. But then I sent that first text, casual as ever, just a simple, "How's the new job treating you?" And then it eventually gave way to more random texts every now and then. "How's the weather over there?" Or, "Are you actually eating real food?" Little things that felt almost normal. Then the text turned into regular conversations, eventually becoming routine calls. Talking to Leo became something I look forward to, an oddly comforting part of the day. The distance should have been a barrier, but instead, it chipped away at the awkwardness until somehow he'd become my happy place again. 1 month later, I found myself in my kitchen, nervously stirring a pot of pasta. I was determined to make it perfect this time, especially since my first attempt earlier this evening had been a disaster. My nerves were in full swing because after all those cautious calls and tentative reconnections, I'd finally taken the plunge and invited Leo over for dinner tonight since he was getting back today from his assignment. It was the first real time I'd had him over since everything fell apart. I texted him a few days ago. "Think you ready to face my excellent taste in pasta again?" And despite everything, I wanted this. I wanted a fresh start, even if it was tentative, even if it felt fragile. So I decided I'd recreate the first meal I'd ever made for him. It might have seemed a bit on the nose, but it felt fitting. When he arrived, he was right on time. I opened the door to find him standing there dressed in his classic round neck tee and cargo pants, the relaxed look he'd worn back when he first moved in next door. For a moment, it felt like no time had passed at all, like we were back to those early days, before secrets and distance. A swell of emotion hit me, but I fought it back. We hugged, and this time it was different. It wasn't the careful, tentative hug of two people dancing around apologies or bruised feelings. It was real, familiar, grounding. Leo lingered just a second longer, exhaling softly against my shoulder. "I've missed this," he said, his voice low, heavy with meaning. "Me too," I said, pulling back enough to meet his eyes, feeling a little unsteady. He glanced over my shoulder, a small smile forming as he spotted the pasta on the stove. "So, round 2 on the pasta, huh?" he teased, his eyebrow quirked. I rolled my eyes, laughing. No judgment if it's a bit rustic. I may or may not have completely ruined the first batch. He chuckled, stepping inside and closing the door. "Rustic I can handle. Just happy to be here." He leaned against the counter, watching me stir the pasta with that steady gaze of his that could be comforting or unnerving, depending on the day. Tonight, it felt like both. The minutes passed quietly as I finished up, and we let the silence settle between us in the way only comfortable silence can. The months of distance, the confusion, the pain, all of it seemed to fade, even if only for the evening. It felt like the best kind of second chance, and we both seemed keenly aware of it. As I dished out the pasta, Leo grabbed some plates, setting the table with practiced ease. I couldn't help but watch him, the little moments of familiarity resurfacing, feeling like home. And as we sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this night was more than just a dinner. It was a quiet promise, something real that we were slowly, carefully rebuilding. Conclusion. In the coming weeks, things between Leo and I didn't magically fall into place. After everything, building a life together was a lot harder than we thought. Leo's assignments kept him constantly on the move, and my own work barely allowed for any sense of stability. It wasn't easy. There were times I wondered if we were just inviting more heartbreak. But even through the short time apart every now and then, we never lost touch with one another, and after nearly a year figuring it out, we settled into a rhythm that finally felt right. It wasn't perfect or simple, but it was ours, and the relationship that was birthed from it was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. As for Mark, he was sentenced to life. I thought about visiting him, about confronting the man who'd upended my world, but in the end, I let it go. Mark had lost his freedom, and that was enough for me. Keeping that chapter closed was the only real power I had left, and I was finally at peace with that. The end. If you absolutely had to choose, would you rather be lied to or ghosted? Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become a part of our Rainbow Force and to stay wholesome.